Battlefield has had some pretty crazy features over the years, from controlling your own massive Yamato battleship to having third-person cameras for soldiers. You might be surprised at the different things the devs have tried over the years. Today, I want to talk about the cool, weird, or even terrible features that have come and gone over the years, some of which you may even want to see come back. Also, huge shout out to Nick930 for letting me use some of his gameplay footage. He painstakingly captured gameplay from old Battlefield games for his massive Battlefield documentary, which is a great watch and I'll link it down below. Let's start at the beginning with Battlefield 1942. It's no surprise that a game from over 20 years ago had way different mechanics than, say, a modern Battlefield, but that's not to say that it didn't have some really cool stuff. So far, it's the only Battlefield game that let you equip jetpacks and actually fly around with them. Despite it being a World War II game, the second DLC was called Secret Weapons, and it brought all kinds of experimental gadgets and vehicles into the game. Now obviously the jetpack wasn't very realistic and the controls were pretty clunky, so it wasn't a huge advantage in general, and I'm actually kind of surprised that we never saw a return of jetpacks in 2142. Perhaps one day jetpacks will make a return. 1942 also allowed players to take control of massive naval vessels, including aircraft carriers, battleships as large as the Yamato, and even submarines. Unfortunately, the gameplay surrounding these ships was nothing to write home about. Even back in 2002, I remember the gameplay not being particularly engaging, and most players opted to just run around on land. Naval warfare with this many ships of this scale has never really been recreated in the Battlefield franchise, though Battlefield 1's Turning Tide DLC did offer some very impressive naval combat, which included destroyers and dreadnought battleships. The next game in the franchise, Battlefield Vietnam, brought some really cool features as well. My favorite of which was a helicopter winch cable that allowed you to carry heavy vehicles such as tanks into combat. This was not only functional and useful, but also hilarious, as the person in the vehicle being airlifted could fire shots at targets while in midair and even be dropped as a bomb on targets below. It was also the first game to bring licensed music into the multiplayer gameplay, which could be blasted from vehicle radios as you drove or flew around. My personal favorite was turning on Nowhere to Run while raining fire down on people with the attack helicopter. Battlefield Bad Company 2's Vietnam DLC and Battlefield Hardline actually repeated this feature. Now, Battlefield 2 is arguably one of the more innovative games in the franchise, as it really changed a lot about how you approach the game with many new features, some of which are no longer around. One of these was a player commander, someone who could spawn on the battlefield and apply to be the commander of the entire team. If multiple people applied, the higher rank would win, but they could also be voted out by the team if it was decided they weren't doing a good job. These commanders could both fight as infantry and then switch to their command view, usually while hiding in a bush or something, and then call in UAVs, satellite scans, supply drops, vehicle drops, and artillery. They could also send objectives to each squad and even had a private VoIP line where they could communicate with their squad leaders directly. On top of this, maps had assets that would control the abilities that commanders could use. For example, if a team went and blew up the other team's artillery installation, their commander could no longer call in artillery strikes. The game also introduced modern military anti-air missile turrets, which a player could then get into, lock onto helicopters and jets, and shoot them down. This was designed as sort of a continuation of the World War II anti-air emplacements used to give certain objectives more anti-air defense. It was a neat feature that we haven't really seen return much in the modern series. Now, the next game in the franchise, Battlefield 2142, got to really have some fun with the traditional formula due to it taking place so far in the future. It introduced classes that could use active cloaking, basically like Predator. It had two-legged mechs, which were kind of like the apex predators of the vehicle world. It had combat VTOLs and hover tanks. Not to mention, of course, the giant titans that acted like flying carriers with shields and massive cannons on the underside, which could rain down on targets below and be positioned strategically to reinforce specific objectives on the map. And the Titan mode itself featured conquest-style capture points, however, they would specifically actually activate missile launchers when you captured them instead of a ticket system, and the missiles would fire off repeatedly, damaging the enemy team's Titan. Players were also given interesting vehicles like an APC designed specifically to launch players extremely high up into the air in drop pods that could then land onto the Titan itself. We've never really seen these mechanics or this style of gameplay repeat itself in the Battlefield franchise, though Battlefield 4 did deliver sort of a spiritual successor with Carrier Assault. It just didn't really offer the same type of gameplay though. And due to Battlefield never really revisiting this distant future theme, we haven't seen the return of many of those vehicles, though Battlefield 4 did have a Final Stand DLC that brought back hover tanks on a few maps, and 2042 has brought back VTOLs to a certain extent. Moving on to the first Bad Company game, this console exclusive release brought in recon airstrikes that functioned very similarly to how a COD killstreak might call in a guided missile. Previous games did allow recon classes to sort of coordinate with artillery systems, but this one allowed the recon class to call in strikes without having to have any sort of teammate or commander assist them. Later in Bad Company 2, this feature evolved to be an artillery strike that recon could call in with their binoculars. It could destroy buildings and even unsuspecting tanks. Now, depending on how you want to classify an official Battlefield game, of course there was Battlefield Heroes, which I did actually play for a short period of time, and it's been the only Battlefield game to have infantry combat fought exclusively from the third-person perspective. This was done, of course, to show off your cosmetics, which, surprise, were the basis of the microtransaction system. Now, Battlefield 1943, again a console exclusive, brought with it a new bomber barrage system, where players could enter a radar bunker and call in bombers to carpet bomb an area of the map. These again functioned kind of similarly to kill streaks from Call of Duty, with limited bomber control, and once the bombs were dropped, you were basically kicked out of the bomber camera. This was quite different when compared to, say, Battlefield 1942 or Battlefield 1, where you actually got to fly bombers as a dedicated vehicle. Now, moving on to Battlefield 3, most of the new things in this title revolved around visual upgrades and general soldier handling and movement improvements. That said, it did bring in some new features that aren't around anymore. Co-op missions were something that you could do with a friend. They acted like simple campaign levels that you had a little bit of teamwork flexibility with, but the highlight of this system was an attack helicopter mission that let a friend fly and their co-pilot gun. We did see co-op return in Battlefield 5 with a full squad combat system, but the layout was a bit different compared to Battlefield 3, and it didn't offer any aerial-based missions. Battlefield 3 also brought squad specializations as a more simplistic attempt to allow you to benefit your squad with a passive ability of your choosing, like increased ammo capacity. And we also saw the introduction of the first external server browser available on PC and stat tracking system called Battlelog. Now, due to the more flexible nature of the web user interface, the developers were able to include all kinds of features like the ability to see the progress of a round before you join, the team roster, and much more before ever even joining a server. This was later phased out for an integrated server browser in the later titles, which sadly reduced the overall features. However, Battlefield 4 did evolve some of those features, notably with a custom emblem editor that let players design intricate decals for vehicles and weapons that all players would see in-game. And as any veteran gamer could have seen coming, many of these new decals ended up being extremely inappropriate. And hilarious, I might add. Somehow this feature persisted for several more Battlefield games until it was ultimately canned due to the moderation difficulty. Now, moving on to Battlefield 4, we saw a new type of commander system. This did differ pretty drastically from the one in Battlefield 2, as you had to select the commander role before joining a server, and it was completely detached from the infantry aspect of the game. You could even play this mode on a mobile device, aka tablet commander. You could call in cruise missiles, UAVs, counter UAVs, and mark high-value targets, which would spot players who were basically doing really well. Arguably, it was a dumbed-down system that was designed to be more accessible, but not quite as engaging as the original. Battlefield Hardline was the last time we saw this type of commander role, though it was dubbed Hacker, and players could do things like hack things in the environment to turn them into traps. Battlefield 4 also introduced the practice range that was easy to access for testing vehicles and weapons. This was, in my opinion, the best version we ever got of the practice range, as it was super easy to access and allowed you to test out pretty much everything in the game. We saw a gun bench version of this feature return in Battlefield Hardline, though it didn't include vehicles. And in Battlefield 5, the designers did add a practice range, but they kind of missed the point of it, as you literally had to spawn and drive to the gun range, and the loadouts were limited, so you couldn't actually test the same setup you might be wanting to use in multiplayer. Battlefield 4 also had a deployment screen that allowed you to see a live video feed of your selected teammates before choosing to spawn on them. This could let you know whether or not you actually wanted to spawn on them. Like if you were about to hop into a vehicle that was about to explode, you could potentially hold spawn and not die immediately. Another neat feature was the inclusion of automated AA turrets on maps with air vehicles. These would usually be placed close to a team's HQ to prevent air from being able to harass spawn locations. If an enemy aircraft was spotted, these turrets would automatically engage them. On the Parasol Storm map, it would allow players to gain control of the automatic AA turret on the destroyer that would collide with one of the central objectives. Whichever team controlled the objective, the AA turret would fight for them. Now next on the list is Battlefield Hardline. Designed by Visceral Games instead of DICE, this cop and criminals based game brought a lot of new ideas to the franchise. Probably one of the favorite additions was the ability to take ammo and health off of squad mates that were carrying those supplies. Often your teammates were distracted in combat, unaware that the player behind them needed some health or extra ammo. Players could now just use the action button to grab what they needed off of their teammates, even if they were totally unaware. At the time, this was seen as sort of a controversial feature, as it could be interpreted as sort of anti-teamwork, but it was ultimately brought back in a later patch for Battlefield 5. However, it hasn't made its way into Battlefield 2042. Hardline also had a redesigned progression system allowing for cache-based unlocks, so instead of having to progress to a certain level or use a weapon or class enough to unlock the next one in line, most of the weapons could just be unlocked through spending cash, which you earned in-game, kind of like XP. So if you really wanted that top-end sniper rifle, but you had been playing predominantly with assault rifles, you could still just spend your cash to get it. The game also introduced vehicle spawnable weapons that would appear in the trunks of cars. Rocket launchers and powerful machine guns could be acquired when you spawned a vehicle and went around to the trunk. This feature quickly became known as the CarPG. Hardline also had a cool vehicle spawn interface showing the amount of time left before a vehicle would become available. This was an extremely nice quality of life feature. There are also some unusual mechanics like interrogations that allowed players using the non-lethal takedown from taser guns to interrogate their downed targets. Upon completing the interrogation, it would spot all the enemies in a vicinity around you. This was a very powerful tool, especially on smaller game modes where every kill mattered. Hardline also introduced a self-revive survivalist syringe, which basically lets you come back from the dead. Players would essentially have to double tap you to make sure that you weren't coming back. Next up, Battlefield 1 brought with it behemoths and elites. The elites were basically an advanced form of Battlefield pickup that allowed you to become a new class altogether. A heavily armored machine gunner, flamethrower class, tank hunter, trench raider, and infiltrator all offered incredibly powerful, if not overpowered abilities when used in the right hands. The trench raider was one of the few instances in Battlefield where melee combat could actually become insanely powerful. Now, the behemoths were certainly some of the coolest additions from a visual standpoint, but could become extremely tiresome to fight against depending on the map. These were massive vehicles that spawned on maps for the losing team. They would give that team some additional power to try and turn the tides. A massive airship, a heavily armored train, a dreadnought battleship, and even a super tank were all incredibly cool to see in action. Also, due to Battlefield 1 taking place further back in history than any other Battlefield game, they were able to introduce the cavalry unit. When spawning on a horse, you actually spawned as a special type of soldier, and you had a lever action rifle. You could deploy ammo and health while on the horseback. You had anti-armor grenades and powerful melee weapons that could insta-kill and even impale their enemies. Battlefield 1 also introduced the bayonet mechanic, allowing players with fixed bayonets on their weapons to enter a charge animation that would instantly kill their impaled targets. The game also brought a much more refined damage system for vehicles, allowing for targeted damage application to, say, the engine block of a tank to stop it from moving, or the wing of an airplane to affect its flight performance. This feature carried over to Battlefield 5 in some ways, but has seen a significant reduction for Battlefield 2042. Next up with Battlefield 5, one of the more standout features it introduced was the fortification system. Building things like sandbags, supply depots, and trenches allowed players to take a little more control over what their current defenses looked like. The only problem with the system was that if an enemy just snuck up on you and killed you, well, now they got all of the fortifications you just built. These fortifications were also relegated to predetermined locations, so you couldn't just like build trenches wherever you wanted, it was already planned out for you. Battlefield 5 also brought in a cool squad leader reinforcement system. Squad leaders would get a selection wheel of abilities that they could call in by spending the reinforcement points that were generated by the entire squad working together. These things could range from supply drops to new vehicles to smoke barrages, and of course the V2 rocket that would obliterate entire locations. Battlefield 5 also introduced new player movement controls like being thrown through the air after a giant explosion, being able to implement a roll when jumping from high locations to prevent fall damage, crouch sprinting, and more. And of course, Battlefield 5 also introduced the controversial attrition mechanic, forcing players to rely more heavily on their teammates to get ammo and health. Health would not recharge on its own in-game. Players could heal once per life and then were forced to get more med packs from medics. You would also spawn with reduced ammo and had to top off from support players or just build supply caches. And despite this, you usually couldn't fight as long without having to go get ammo or health from teammates or caches. Now, here we are at present with Battlefield 2042. Many of the features developed by past Battlefield games have made it into this title. However, all the features I just mentioned are not included in the current title for better or worse. And of course, I can completely understand why many of the features were discontinued, and I think there's some strong arguments to be made for bringing back some of them as well. Now, back in 2019, I did make a forgotten features video that was more focusing on things that I really wanted DICE to bring back into the modern games, and I gotta say that many of those features were remedied with the latest title, which is actually kinda cool. So after hearing about all these features, which ones do you think you'd want to see again, or even become staple features of the franchise? Personally, I think that vehicle spawn timers and taking ammo and health from teammates who are unaware of you could just become staple features in every Battlefield game. Also, I do really miss that Battlefield Vietnam helicopter winch system. It was just fun and allowed really cool teamwork and flanks from air and ground working together. It'd certainly be cool to see VTOLs in 2042 or Heinz being able to airlift tanks around the map. Let me know what you think about all these Battlefield features we have seen over the years and haven't made it into the latest titles. And if you want to watch a deeper dive into Battlefield's dated conquest mode and brainstorm some ideas to make it more competitive in today's modern world, check out this video here. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap signing off.